I'm lonely here. Oh, not really. I have a phone, the perfect companion that makes you feel lonelier.
Welcome back, nerds. Fino here with a guide for Lady Avalon, aka Proto Merlin. She hails from the timeline where Faith became an otome game, and their version of FGO has people blowing hundreds of dollars on Summer Gilgamesh, while the girls are relegated to costume duty. But returning to our dimension for a bit, Lady Avalon is a limited 5-star pretender introduced in Arctic Summer World. What's she pretending about? Well, I still need to read the event story, but if I were to venture a guess, it probably has something to do with the fact that she has Independent Manifestation, a passive that's normally reserved for current and former beasts. Also void cheeky, but she can make piss come down as snow, so I'm not gonna question that one. Now that we're thoroughly suspicious of our newcomer, let's see what she's got going on. First up is Light Be in Your Hands. This is a targeted 3-turn arts buff that increases max health for that same duration. It also amplifies crit damage for a single turn. Since comparisons to the original Merlin are inevitable, let's cover those as we go along. Light Be in Your Hands is a mirror of hero creation. Same magnitudes, same cooldowns, but with two notable differences. The obvious one is that it buffs arts instead of buster. For general usage, this just boils down to the pair being intended for use with different card types. For Immortal team purposes, however, hero creation lets Morgan or Himiko cash out on big damage turns, while Light Be in Your Hands adds a bit more consistency in the charge generation department. The other difference is that Light Be in Your Hands is Lady Avalon's first skill, while hero creation is Merlin's third. Keep that in the back of your head for later. Next, we have Flower Blooming on a Summer's Night. This is a party attack buff with 20% flat charge and 1 stage of overcharge. While the attack buff and flat charge are consistent with Merlin's dreamlike charisma, the overcharge is something new, coming at the cost of Lady Avalon having this skill on a cooldown that's 1 turn longer. I'd say it's well worth the trade. Arts teams tend to focus on noble phantasms anyway, and having overcharge on demand is very exploitable. The Immortal team is, again, a notable beneficiary, probably the most practical one too. But the most extreme example is Chen Gong, who gains a powerful double tap effect against anything that survives his initial attack. And it is possible to run the two together, even though the Gongmeister typically likes 50% chargers. Lady Avalon provides 20%, Chen Gong has 10% on a skill, and then you get another 20% from his starting charge of pen skill. And then Castoria serves up the remaining 50%. On top of this, you can also chain Lady Avalon's Noble Phantasm to force that overcharge even higher. You do this by exploiting Succubus Ridge, perhaps the biggest divergence point between Prime and Proto Merlin. Her version is a party invulnerability with 2 special mechanics. The first is that it stops the enemies from getting charged 1 time. This mechanic won't interfere with the invulnerability since it only applies the turn after you use this skill. One very useful property of this is that it can help you manage enemies with desynced charge bars, buying you time to either eliminate one of the problems or come up with another defensive countermeasure. The second is that Purin gains 20% charge per enemy on the field. Against a standard 3 bogey wave, that's 60% charge on demand. Combine that with 20% from Flower Blooming and another 20% from her pen skill, and you can easily get a full meter. And that's not even counting the 30% that Castoria splashes across your frontline. There's no cap to this, aside from the number of enemies on the field, so for those 6 enemy waves, you get 120%. In contrast, Merlin's illusion has no charge, but it does have an AoE crit chance reduction and a single turn of star generation. The latter is largely insignificant in my book, but the former does have its applications. Some bosses primarily threaten you by stacking colossal crit buffs and then one-shotting your servants. Reducing crit chance gives you one last line of defense against this. I've encountered some people that have the misconception that the Immortal team doesn't take damage. It absolutely can, which is why you run a healer in the first place. Even with a fully overcharged round of Avalon, it's possible for one servant to get targeted for 3 attacks turn after turn and eventually get hit with something significant. It's absolutely happened to me. Murphy's Law is one of the biggest threats to the Immortal team, since it operates on longer timescales than offensive setups. If I had to split hairs, I'd say the Dick Wizard can potentially have an edge against enemies with longer charge bars like Berserkers, but only if they also pose that massive crit threat I mentioned. It helps that for extremely tricked out Merlins, he has access to an anti-Berserker append skill. Not advocating that you prioritize it over his charge append, but it is a lever you can pull. The Snatch Sorceress generally has a better version of this skill, and it may even prove decisive against enemies with extremely short charge bars like archers. You get more room to recover, and you can spend more effort on Castoria or Morgan's Arts cards to ensure that you have all 3 of your noble phantasms. Lady Avalon's contribution to that chain is Winds of Avalon. This is a non-damaging arts card that increases your frontline's max health and gives them charge per turn for 3 turns. These effects are tied to NP level, meaning you see a notable gain in efficiency as you get duplicates. Going from NP1 to NP2 gets you an additional 1k health and 2.5% charge per turn. Ideally, you go to NP5 so you can get 5k and 10% respectively, but this is of course whale territory. The overcharge is stars per turn for 5 turns. The default amount is 5, but in the Immortal team, you always place Merlin's NP second, so you can expect a bit more in that setup. 10 if you run Morgan, 15 with Himiko, and more in cycles where you use Flower Blooming on a summer's night. The overcharge effect is the same between Merlin and Purin, but the other elements do have differences that are noteworthy. Lady Avalon uses a max health buff, while Merlin grants normal healing. Max health buffs are effectively healing, but through a different mechanism. Even though you return to your old maximum once the effect expires, you keep your current health up to that cap. For some edge cases, max health should be better than healing if you're afflicted with a healing down debuff, but healing is better than max health when you're getting buff blocked, assuming the regen effect itself isn't what's getting blocked. More significantly, max health works as an overheal and gives you a buffer even at max health for attacks that go through your protection. However, pure healing is more useful in situations where you're persistently taking damage, like through unremovable damage over time effects. Merlin has an advantage in that last situation since his Garden of Avalon lasts for 5 turns, while Purin's Winds of Avalon only lasts for 3. However, Purin has more room to grow in terms of generating charge for your team. Both versions start at 5% per turn, and while Merlin has an initial advantage due to his longer effect duration, Lady Avalon's effect gets stronger with NP levels. Doing some napkin math, Lady Avalon needs NP3 to generate the same charge in her 3 turns that Merlin does in his 5. But this data point can be a bit misleading. If you're running the Immortal team, you're locked into a 3-turn cycle anyway, because that's how long Round of Avalon lasts. And everything you do in the Immortal team is in service of Castoria's noble Phantasm. So logically, Winds of Avalon becomes better at NP2 for most fights. But I'm gonna make the case that you want her around even at NP1, and even if you already have Merlin. The main one as I see it is that she's much less likely to be a bottleneck at the start of a fight. Succubus Rich is a big part of it certainly, but it goes deeper than that. First of all, Purin has the passive Rapid Casting Monster, which starts her with 20% additional charge. Combine this with her charge depend and you have up to 40% right off the bat. And if you somehow get desynced through a charge drain or supremely bad RNG on Purin, Himiko, or Morgan, you can fall back on Flower Blooming on a summer's night. Its overcharge effect lets you brute force an empowered Round of Avalon, so as long as Castoria can use her NP, you have legs. I'm sure it's a little annoying at this point that I dedicate so much of this video to the workings of the Immortal team. I'm getting annoyed just writing this. But the reality is that it's one of the most consistent boss-killing strategies in the game, though certainly not the fastest one. Lady Avalon in particular finds herself sort of corralled into this box because if you're running an arts team, you want Castoria 95% of the time, and if you're running both, you've already assembled 2/3 of the Immortal team. You can run an actual arts attacker in that 3rd slot, but you're just trading stability for speed, so there's not a whole lot of nuance beyond going, oh, Summer Musashi could turn out some ridiculous crit turns, or wow, you can run Liang Yi and pretend she does something. While you can pivot between the two styles, I generally don't use Lady Avalon in endgame setups outside of the Immortal team. Though to be fair, the same largely applies to the original Merlin as well. His other bread and butter is enabling cheesy 1-turn kill setups where you spend more time in the loading screen than actually playing the game. But I'm just talking about the endgame here. For account building purposes, she's remarkably useful, and you shouldn't let the endgame focus skew of this video distract you from that. Both Merlins are valuable as resource engines. Giving effective healing and recurring charge in stars is useful at all stages of the game. The Merlins add consistency to your teams, which is what separates them from pure healers like Media Lily and bulk resource generators like Tamamo. The ability to fire and forget frees up your chains. You can spend less time thinking about Lady Avalon's next noble Phantasm and take opportunistic arts and mighty chains for your other servants. I didn't really have a good place to put this, but for Purin's Phantasm selection, I'd start with Prisma Cosmos. Its charge per turn adds quite a bit of consistency, even more so once you include her Mixed Blood passive. Getting between 13 and 15% free charge every turn is one hell of a drug. 20-30 is another option for increased star access. Then there are the defensive CEs. Holy Shroud of Magdalene works against male bosses, and you can use Iron Will training otherwise. Lastly, her Bondcraft Essence grants party arts and crit buffs. It's alright, but I'd prioritize the other options. While Proto Merlin can be used in farming setups with a turn 1 Winds of Avalon, I don't really put much stake in this arrangement. You can always grab a Castoria off your friends list and pair her with Zhu Fu, a much more accessible support and one better suited for enabling farmers. For any fights where offense is your sole concern, the pure power of double Castoria is hard to top. This is the dynamic that pushes Lady Avalon towards the Immortal team as you get more and more powerful arts attackers. But if you want to get cute with it, you can backline her in fights that call for early aggression, but then degenerate into a stall phase. In that situation, using a plug suit to swap from a second Castoria into Lady Avalon can work out to your advantage. You can stay flexible, in other words. Here's one thing I wouldn't recommend for Lady Avalon. Her crit steroid and overcharge buff are on her first and second skills respectively, meaning that esports are technically possible. You keep her below max level as a disposable buffer, in other words. I've never run into a particular situation where having her go down in flames was better than keeping her alive as a resource engine. Like maybe there's some sort of minimum turn strategy that does this, but I'd argue this is well outside the realm of practicality for most players. She's not like a Zhu Fu or Santa Martha, where they can shit out their effects once and be done with it. That, and for Immortal team purposes, you want Purin at her max level and at the highest NP level you can field. So TLDR, keep your copies together. That said, if any of you have made the esports work, let me know. I'm curious. Two final points of comparison between her and Merlin. Point the first is a funny novelty. Oberon has a passive that decreases buff success for Merlin, but for whatever reason, this doesn't affect Lady Avalon, despite her, ostensibly being Merlin. I wouldn't really run the two of them together anyway, but it's either a funny oversight or perhaps something with sinister implications. The more important point is the difference in their classes. The Pretender class only takes double damage from foreigners and has resistance against alter egos. Though they do reduce damage against riders, being defensively class neutral often benefits Lady Avalon in that context. Merlin on the other hand is very much worried about riders and alter egos, but quite dangerous against assassins. One disadvantage of Pretenders is that they have significantly higher base star absorption than casters, meaning that Morgan in particular tends to be undermined in that relationship, and in general this can cause some frustration if you run her with arts berserkers like Vlad. Ultimately though, I'd put class interactions very low on the totem pole of deciding when to use Merlin and when to use Purin. Losing damage does suck, but all that other stuff I've been talking about, look at that first, especially if you're using the Immortal team. Suffice it to say that Lady Avalon is very much worth having in your account. But how should you prioritize your roles? If you have neither Merlin nor Lady Avalon, getting her at NP1 should be your highest priority during Arctic Summer World's duration. Having either one unlocks an extremely powerful gameplay style that can bail you out of fights that are otherwise hopeless if your roster is below a certain power level. If you already have either version of Merlin, however, I'd actually prioritize the imminent Summer Scotty. Having her unlocks a number of quick-based strategies, and having both her and the original Scotty lets you cheat in fights that restrict your friends list access. Once you get Ruler Scotty, then get your first Lady Avalon if that's the case. Then you have to decide between getting additional copies of Lady Avalon or going deep for Summer Ibuki. If you're lacking a good generalist arts attacker, Ibuki should be your priority. It's worth noting that while Lady Avalon does get tangible benefits from additional NP levels, she does most of what you need at NP1 already. Good luck and let me know how your rolls turn out. Like if you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more, and come to twitch.tv/Finotaisen where I stream every week, 3 PM Pacific time, Friday through Sunday. This week I'll be rolling for Summer Scotty on Friday, playing golf with your friends on Saturday, and going the distance for Ibuki on Sunday. NP6. You won't want to miss it.